and welcome to another YouTube presentation by the London Transport Museum Friends. Our speaker this time will be familiar to many of you because Roger Torode has already delivered a presentation in this series of talks. Last time he focused on his home patch of London and on the story of public transport in Waltham Forest. Although Roger has lived and worked in London for very many years now, he grew up in Kidderminster in Midland Red territory and indeed worked for that company briefly as a conductor. Roger's fascination with Midland Red has stayed with him, and he's the co-author of 2 books on the company. Roger's brief in this presentation covers Midland Red's history from its origin in the early 1900s through to its fragmentation in the 1970s. Before I hand over to Roger, here's my usual reminder. If you're watching this during the live premiere, you can post comments and questions to Roger by using the chat function. If you're watching at a later date, then please leave your feedback, which we do like to see. So, Roger, what can you tell us about the Friendly Midland Red?
Thank you, Barry. It was suggested that this talk could be about Midland Red, following my recent book with Malcolm Keeley for Capital Transport. So here we have a brief history of Midland Red, its growth, style and vehicles, something about the people who ran it, showing some of the links to London and some of the differences. I grew up in Midland Red territory, then moved to London in 1970 and have been here ever since. The title comes from this slogan introduced in the late 1940s and used until the early 70s, though I have to admit that when I worked for them for a time in 1968-69, I discovered that most of the crews were known to the passengers as the Red Devils. Midland Red was the largest bus company in the UK outside London. It's interesting because of its size and operations, and also because for around 50 years it designed and built its own buses, which were often very advanced and led the industry in many ways. They were also sometimes idiosyncratic in their designs, though this did improve later on. It had nearly 2,000 buses and coaches at its peak in the early 1950s, covering 12,000 square miles a year, with almost 5 million passengers a year on bus services, express coaches and holiday tours. It grew as part of the British electric traction empire. Towards the end of the 19th century, tramways were developing in towns and cities up and down the country. BET was registered in October 1896 with its headquarters in Kingsway above Holborn Tube Station. Its objectives were the carriage of goods and passengers and the generation and distribution of electricity. It invested in building new tramways and the purchase and modernisation of existing tramways. There were a number of early horse bus services and tramways in Birmingham, also steam trams. BET was buying into every transport company they could. They were more interested in electricity, but bought horse bus companies as feeders to the trams or if they were in competition with them. In 1899, BET bought the assets of the Birmingham General Omnibus Company, which had 70 buses and 500 horses, but which had failed financially. In 1900, they bought new horse buses for this operation, which they specified should be bright red. In 1904, a different company, Birmingham Motor Express, set up B&MMO as a means of raising capital for a motor bus operation, but it failed to raise sufficient investment and the director sold out to BET, who used it to merge all of their bus assets in the area. So BMMO operations started in August 1905 with around 20 motor buses, 100 horse buses and 1,000 horses. A rising star was Orlando Cecil Power, traffic manager at the age of 23 and generally known to people as OCP. But these motor buses were very unreliable. OCP later referred to the purchase of all of this as a moment of weakness for the company. In 1907, the motor buses were abandoned. They just had the horse buses then, so we now had a motor omnibus company with no motor buses. Horses continued in importance for goods traffic and other activities until 1929. Some of the buses went to Deal in Kent, prompted by Sidney Gark, the son of Emile, who had founded BET and became its chairman later. Sidney asked to be allowed to experiment in Deal, an area he considered more suitable to motor traffic. He took 6 buses and formed Deal and District, a precursor of East Kent. The other 3 went to Stratford-on-Avon for sightseeing work. This picture shows the staff around one of the buses at the Deal and District Depot. The man at the wheel is L.G. Wyndham Shire, who had been with the Croydon Tramways and who made his reputation by keeping these buses in Deal going. He was not an office-bound engineer. He was a hands-on man, down the pit, repairing the buses and, when necessary, manufacturing spare parts himself. The boy on the starting handle is Charles Collier. At the age of 14, he was the depot boy, engineer, cleaner, bus conductor. When the factory inspectors came around, he was shoved out of the window and told to disappear for the day. By 1910-11, reliable motor buses began to be available with the B-type in London and the TS petrol electric. OCP was very loyal to his horse bus drivers, and he wanted a bus that was going to be easy for retraining those horse bus drivers with the new motor buses. Here's a 1909 Daimler, a petrol electric, which they ran for a month in 1911. They had invested with Tilling-Stevens in the hope that they would produce a viable vehicle. And the petrol electric bus of Tilling-Stevens, of course, had a petrol engine which did not directly drive the bus through a gearbox, but via a dynamo powering a large electric motor. So in May 1912, motor buses were reintroduced, this time using Tilling-Stevens buses, which were painted red with black relief. They had the BEC magnet emblem on the side. Shire then arrived from Deal to manage the engineering side, and Charles Collier, the boy on the starting handle, came with him to Midland Red and spent the rest of his career there. In 1913, the buses had the Midland fleet name on the side, so now it is Midland Red. However, Birmingham Corporation was purchasing and electrifying the tramways in their area, and horse buses could not compete with them. The Birmingham Watch Committee would not authorise bus routes that competed with their trams. BMMO's bus network was slowly shrinking. In September 1913, Birmingham Corporation introduced electric trams along the Hagley Road, the major route to the west and northwest, so BMMO had to withdraw from that route. In February 1914, BMMO and Birmingham Corporation agreed that BMMO would not compete with the corporation inside Birmingham, and the corporation would not compete outside. BMMO's HQ would move to Bearwood Garage. Fair protection was given within the Birmingham boundary, and the Tennant Street garage and most of the buses were handed over to the corporation. The company then embarked on an ambitious programme to link every town and city within a radius of 30 miles of Birmingham. Local services were introduced in districts just outside Birmingham, such as Four Oaks, seen here. It was now truly the Birmingham and Midland Motor Omnibus Company, BMMO, more usually known as Midland Red. The buses now bought were Tilling-Stevens single-deckers. Then came the First World War. In 1914, other bus operators had to give up their buses to the military. They may have been bought with a war subsidy which obliged them to hand the buses over if hostilities commenced. But the military did not like petrol electrics, so BMMO kept its buses and continued to acquire new ones. Other operators had routes and no buses, while Midland Red had buses and wanted to acquire routes, so BMMO took over their operations and expanded rapidly. Examples are Worcester and Kidderminster, Worcestershire Motor Transport in these pictures. Also in Tamworth, South Warwickshire, and so Midland Red expanded rapidly. Some of these were converted to gas operation, as here in 1917. When peace resumed in 1918, there was initially a shortage of vehicles that held back the expansion, but as elsewhere, there was growing competition from men who were demobbed from the army, having been trained in driving and as vehicle mechanics, given a war gratuity and able to set up in competition with cheap war surplus vehicles. This period also showed the greater flexibility of buses over trams. They could be moved from route to route easily. In addition, it was a problem for BEC generally. Thus, it could be difficult and costly to get new tramways approved, and local authorities had the right to compulsorily purchase tramways in their area at regular intervals. So the lower cost and flexibility of motor buses became more attractive to BET. I have mentioned the two men most significant in the development of Midland Red, O.C. Power and L.G. Wyndham Shire. Both were dynamic, hard-working, exceptional people, and the relationship between them was interesting to say the least. Power was likeable, congenial, someone who got on well with people. Shire wasn't. Power had a background with horse buses and trams. He had good relationships with staff and all the people he dealt with. He was a Birmingham magistrate. In the early 1900s, he was involved at the same time in horse buses, motor buses, horse trams, steam trams, overhead electric trams, accumulator electric trams, cable trams, and other activities. On Sundays, he would ride his horse around the district to see what was going on. 7 days in the week were not enough to do everything he wanted to do. Shire, on the other hand, was difficult, temperamental, maybe happiest down the pit getting things to work. Not a politician, not a people person, as we would say today. This resulted in the company operating almost as two separate organisations, with two different reporting lines and structures and different uniforms for operating and engineering staff. Drivers reported up through a management chain to Shire. Conductors reported up through the traffic organisation to OCP. At head office, it is said there was a green baize door and no one dared pass through it between the two departments. This was a period of aggressive expansion and vehicle developments, and Midland Red was successfully crushing the opposition. Shire was developing the buses to provide speed and economy. Existing buses were too slow. He wanted lightweight vehicles with the capacity of the Tilling-Stevens but the speed of the opposition. He experimented with Garfords and Model T Fords from the USA. Here are two British-built Ford Model Ts with 11 seats constructed in 1921, a basic, straightforward design, simple and reliable. And there were 14 Garford 20 horsepower buses imported from the USA with bodies built by the company in 1922, and these had a remarkable turn of speed. Meanwhile, Power was developing the network, a policy of attack. He would operate anywhere a reasonable return could be obtained, everywhere within 30 miles of Birmingham. He said he was painting the map red. Here's a 1920 black and white map. I discovered this chap from research, James Savage, who arrived in 1919. He had started his career at the BET Holborn offices in 1901 when he was 16. He clearly had artistic skills. He joined the Artists' Rifles in the First World War. In London, he would have known the poster work of the Underground Group and was working a few doors away from the Central School of Art, now Central St Martin's, which was run by the London County Council and which did posters for the London County Council tramways. Edward Johnson ran a poster design course there. Under Savage, there was a tremendous output of leaflets, brochures, posters, booklets, etc. Poster here for the Malvern service, later the 144. Here's a coloured map that he produced at that time. He also produced these line drawings, which were very familiar on timetables and leaflets. 45 pictures, including 2 buildings, 2 trucks and a horse, which he did up to his retirement in 1953. Towns and villages throughout the Midlands were now being connected by Midland Red buses. Here is Clent, just to the west of Birmingham. In 1921, they commenced regular long-distance services to Weston-super-Mare and Llandudno, some of the nearest seaside destinations to Birmingham. Here are Tilling-Stevens, Showerbang and Saloon buses loading in Birmingham, a choice of open or closed vehicle, and there's the conductor loading luggage onto the roof. Here is a major private hire from Stafford in the early 1920s. The vehicles continued to be the latest versions of Tilling-Stevens single-deckers, with Shire's modifications to the engines, and always with front entrance bodies. Shire suggested that buses don't always need to stop if they've got a front entrance. But the need became paramount for a double-decker. Shire designed one that could easily be converted to a single-decker, which they were later on. You can see how much he cared for his drivers. The staircase on this bus, which looks very much like their single-deckers, the staircase was where the driver was, and the driver's been moved onto the front wheel. 56 of these were built, thankfully with a driver's cab by then, and Tilling-Stevens again with modifications to the engine. Shire was continuously developing and wanting changes from Tilling-Stevens. He wanted buses that were speedy, lightweight, reliable, easy to drive, with maximum seating capacity. Buses were then generally either light 14-seaters or heavy truck-like buses. He demanded so many modifications that Tilling-Stevens began to say no. So Shire persuaded his directors at BET that Midland Red should build its own buses. There was a logic to this, because being based in the West Midlands, with much of the motor manufacturing industry around them, they were surrounded by component manufacturers. The design of vehicles was very simple, and the layout very simple. All the parts were produced locally, so they could assemble their ideal combination of features in the works. So here's their first prototype bus, the standard bus of 1923. It was based on a Tilling-Stevens chassis with a BMMO engine and revised gearbox and transmission. 32 seats, 4-cylinder, 4-litre engine, pneumatic tyres, plywood exterior panels, a neat, fast, reliable, lightweight bus. It went into production in 1924 for BMMO and some other companies, and they built buses and shower banks to this design. 205 built in 1924-25, 113 of them for BMMO, Northern General, Trent, Cambridge and Llandudno also taking examples of them. They were labelled SOS, and Shire always refused to say what this meant. So some people suggest it's superior omnibus specification, but others think maybe it was Shire's own specification. Shire may have been difficult, but he was able to recruit good people. This is Eric Ottaway, who as a young man in 1920 joined the Clement Talbot Car Company in Ladbroke Grove, London, as an apprentice. In 1923, he moved to the Associated Sunbeam Motor Car Company in Wolverhampton. Sunbeam was a leading motorsport manufacturer. Their cars came first, second and fourth in the 1923 French Grand Prix, and in 1925 their car came second in the Le Mans 24-hour race. World land speed records were set by Guinness in 1922 and Malcolm Campbell in 1925 in Sunbeam cars. In 1925, Ottaway became Assistant Engineer in Charge Rolling Stock BMMO. In 1929, he moved again to LGOC in London, becoming Assistant Experimental Engineer. Then he became Technical Officer Mechanical Engineering Road for London Transport, and in 1940 Chief Engineer Buses and Coaches. As well as maintaining the road fleet during the Second World War, he became General Manager of London Aircraft Production, in charge of producing all those components for airplanes in factories around London and then assembling them into Halifax bombers at Leavesden Aerodrome. In 1945, he became Works Manager Buses and Coaches for London Transport and then Chief Supplies Officer and a board member. He died in 1967. Now, Brian Staines, who many of us knew, worked for Eric Ottaway when he first started in the Major Contracts Office at 55 Broadway from 1955. So if you knew Brian Staines, you knew someone who knew Eric Ottaway. Through the later 1920s, smaller tram systems were being replaced by buses around the country, and BET were replacing the Black Country tramways, which they owned, with Midland Red buses. In 1928, the Worcester trams were replaced by Midland Red buses on an agreement with Worcester Council on sharing the returns that became the standard for other companies and local authorities throughout the country. There were continuing vehicle developments throughout the 1920s, with progress in design each year. This is the FS of 1926, a forward control version of the standard with 34 seats. 64 of these were built for Midland Red. The porch over the entrance is characteristic, and the curved canopy over the engine. This is a charabanc version with a half cab for the driver, and 18 of these were built. The 1927 model was named the Q for Queen, their feeling of how good it was. It had 37 seats, maximising capacity by moving the bulkhead forwards, resulting in a smaller cab. 106 of these were built. The coach version, the QLC of 1928, now had a single entrance door rather than a door for each row of seats. The 1929 bus was named M for Madam. It had 34 more comfortable seats and an improved body design in order to attract ladies onto the buses in the off-peak period. 49 of these were built. Here is a full frontal view of the M-Type, showing the idiosyncratic design. The offset engine gave the driver more room in exchange for the shorter cab needed to increase passenger space. Those wheels with ball tyres were probably just put on while it was in the works. I hope it didn't go out on the road like that. Here is one at Hereford. Notice the unglazed cab door hinged on the front pillar. The petrol tank is under the driver's seat. He's sitting on it. That would stop you having accidents, wouldn't it? 1928 was the peak year for sales. 179 QL buses and 15 QL coaches were sold to 9 related companies. But then the AEC Regal and Leyland Tiger were introduced, which cut down sales. By 1935, it was only Trent still buying SOS buses. However, Midland Red sold 1,000 buses to these 9 operators over 17 years. They were reliable and long-lived. Some of them lasted 20 years in service, through the war and beyond. These sales were greater than Guy and Maudslay and only slightly less than Daimler. Long-distance services continued to be developed through the 1920s. Here is a leaflet for the London service. And coach cruises were also developed to a very high standard. Here is a QRC of 1930, picking up outside one of the hotels that were used. Considerable publicity was produced, bright and cheerful, appropriate to the time and place, constantly changing with the season of the year and encouraging travel to all parts of the Midlands and beyond. It was said that you needed dark glasses when you went past the Midland Red office to avoid being dazzled. The item on the right is a three-dimensional map of the area. A series of these were produced for inquiry offices, showing the routes through the local towns, villages and landscapes. The company also offered to lend out magic lantern slides for local groups and societies to show. These used hand-coloured slides, some of which have survived. They came with a script, or alternatively, if you were near Birmingham, Mr. John Hingley might attend with his projector to give the lecture, and a soloist and pianist could be arranged if required. Another innovation was this booklet of mascot tours, which drew the tour on a map and named it after the shape it suggested. This was very popular with children who insisted their parents went into the office to collect a copy, so getting the company's publicity into people's homes. Midland Red could provide for very large private hires. This one was an outing for the Dudley Co-op to Evesham in July 1932, using 56 vehicles. And here is another clever piece of publicity. This appeared in the Birmingham Post after a 1934 bank holiday. I'm not sure of the dates, but this may have appeared before the well-known railway posters showing children talking to the engine driver. A staff bulletin started in the 1930s, which developed into a magazine which was also sold to passengers on the bus. It had competitions, travel suggestions and serialised stories. So now we meet conductor Jim Dutton of Stourbridge, who held the record for magazine sales. He sold over 1,000 copies in a month on 2 occasions and nearly 900 in a week with the Christmas number. A modest chap, when asked to explain his success, he put it down to his perseverance, personality and popularity. In 1928, the railways obtained powers to operate motor buses. They had sought these powers because they feared competition and wanted to be involved themselves. In 1930, the Great Western Railway and the LMS bought 50% of Midland Red, and Great Western Railway bus services were merged with Midland Reds. The company then bought Black and White Motorways of Cheltenham, which was developing a long-distance service network. Shares of Black and White were then sold on to neighbouring companies, and in 1934, the Associated Motorways network was formed. Then came the Road Traffic Act of 1930, which introduced road service licensing and ended free competition on bus services. So licenses held by operators had a value, and it became worthwhile to buy out your competitors. So Midland Red continued to expand by this means. Vehicle design continued to improve through the 1930s. A range of new single-deckers brought improved capacity and performance. This is an IM4 of 1932, IM standing for Improved M-Type. There was also a 6-cylinder version, and there was a move to diesel engines during this time. This picture clearly shows the route number stencils and destination board under the canopy. The stencils were slotted into a frame in front of the light. There were 2 stencils of each digit on each bus, so for many years Midland Red did not have routes numbered 111, 222, 333 and so on. The boards were solid and heavy, with the destination on each side. The conductor had to collect route boards for each of his journeys at the beginning of his shift, hoping all the ones he needed were there and carry them to his bus. Bill Clark, who was a London Underground director, did this as a student conductor when he was at Shrewsbury. The continuing development led to the ON class of 1934 to 1940, with the DON diesel version and the later SON saloon, single-deckers which lasted well into the 1950s. The final version of this bus arrived in 1940, an attractive vehicle, and one still exists at Whittle and often carries passengers. Midland Red had become entirely single-deck in 1929, when the previous double-deckers were withdrawn. A prototype was built in 1931, top left, and 50 more in 1932-3, with 52-seat bodies by several builders to Midland Red design. In 1933, a front entrance version was built, again with a rather individual prototype, but followed by some handsome vehicles, becoming in total 350 front entrance double-deckers up to 1939. They had comfortable interiors, the first being to this design, and the later versions to a slightly smoother outline. Again, these worked well through the 1940s and 50s, giving long lives. In addition, many were taken by Trent Motor Services. Coach design continued to develop for the long-distance services. This is an XL of 1929, a splendid vehicle that proved too heavy and was rebuilt with more power and a robust chassis, becoming the RR coach of 1930. RR meant Rolls-Royce, a rather grand description of the vehicle, and 47 of these were built. The next version was built lower, the LLR, or Low Rolls-Royce, of 1935, of which there were 31. And this splendid vehicle is the OLR, the Open Low Rolls-Royce of 1935 for coach cruises. 25 of these were built with a 6.5-litre petrol engine. The driver continued to be in with the passengers on these cruise vehicles rather than in a separate cab. The next version was the SLR of 1937, the Saloon Low Rolls-Royce for express services, and 50 of these were built with a full-width cab and concealed radiator, a very advanced Art Deco design with an interior like a cinema. Here is one on tour in the Scottish Highlands. And finally, the ON coach of 1939, the ONC, of which 25 were built with dual bodies, and these continued in service right through the 1950s. In 1935-6, Shire produced 4 rear-engine single-decker bus prototypes, 25 years ahead of their time. One of the first designs with the driver and entrance ahead of the wheels. They had petrol engines transverse at the rear, bodies built by the company. The first one on the left there was a service bus. The second one, CHA1, was a very luxurious coach with full Art Deco styling and a sumptuous interior to it. But then came the Second World War. In 1939, Midland Red had a fleet of 1,300 buses, all made by the company, 30 garages from Shrewsbury to Leicester, Banbury and Hereford. This is the scene at Stourbridge with a row of own-built buses all ready for service, but typical of all of the garages. The Second World War led to huge changes, of course. Had producer gas trailers being attached to some of the buses, an end of vehicle production, an end of coach services and tours. This produced the need to convert some of those coaches to service buses, and here's a rather sad picture really of an open low Rolls-Royce coach like the one I showed you a few moments ago, the OLR, one before still as a coach, one on the right converted into a bus with the driving position brought forwards to a half cab and a roof put on and so on, and they spent the rest of their lives in that fashion. In 1940, Shire suddenly retired at the age of 55. This was rather odd and very sudden. One suspects that the company were fed up with him, a difficult, extravagant man, and with a world war going on outside the company, it was too much to have a continuing war inside it as well. Donald Sinclair was immediately appointed chief engineer. In fact, he arrived on the next day, so this was clearly something that had been planned in advance. Sinclair was a vehicle engineer. In 1931, he became assistant to the chief engineer at Northern General, who operated many SOS buses and had been advanced in development of side-engine single-deckers. The next thing that happened in 1943 was that O.C. Power suddenly died at a meeting in London. So Sinclair became general manager and chief engineer of the company, the first time that all these posts were brought together. Sinclair removed the name SOS from the buses, and he rebuilt the rear-engine single-deckers and coach to underfloor engine buses. He was not convinced about rear engines. Drivers had difficulty hearing the engine, which they needed to change gear. Here are 2 of the rebuilt buses. The lower one has some of the lady drivers recruited during the war with it. Sinclair also modified one of the FEDD double-deckers with an enclosed bonnet and some streamlining, shown here with its wartime restricted headlights and white wings. This led to a 1945 prototype double-decker named the D1, with an enclosed front, a new design of body, and a rear entrance like the utility buses that had been received during the war. The years after the end of the war saw a major boom in demand for bus travel and heavy passenger loadings on a war-weary fleet. The 4 rebuilt single-deckers and a 5th, which was of integral construction, were named S1 to S5 and led to the S6, which went into production in 1946. The distinctive design included a grille for the front-mounted radiator and an open entrance with a porch and a hinged door into the saloon. The design was developed to 8 feet wide and 30 feet long, together with other changes, so that by 1951 there were almost 500 underfloor engine single-deckers in service at a time when most companies were still buying front-engine single-deckers. This was the standard single-decker of the late 1940s and the 1950s. There was also a garage building programme and new fleets of double-deckers and coaches. The works were busy building single-deckers, so at first double-deckers were bought in. The first 100 ordered were AEC Regents, with the body design developed from the D1 and received rather slowly in 1948 to 1950. The Midland Red built double-decker was the D5 of 1949 to 50, now 8 feet wide and very comfortable vehicles, which were followed in 1952 by the D5B, which introduced platform doors, a feature of all future double-deckers. Here's a D5 in Ludlow and a D5B in the right-hand picture. It was also necessary to rebuild the utility buses due to the poor construction of their bodies, and this was carried out with an eye to their design, with built-up wings and sliding windows. There were also 57 coaches built in 1948 to 50 with dual bodies to Midland Red design, in 2 versions, one for express service and the other for cruises and tours. Again, these were built at a time when other operators could only buy front-engine coaches. The company had tremendous status in the country. The picture top right was taken in Chasley Corbett for a BTA brochure of 1953, encouraging touring in the UK. The 2 with bicycles are actually members of Midland Red staff, together with 2 passers-by, who they co-opted for the picture. In 1948, Sinclair visited the USA to see manufacturers and operators there. He spent time with the Greyhound operation, which would have influenced his development of the Motorway Express service. Interestingly, when he came back, 1 or 2 special vehicles that were built, a modified S9 and the beginning of the S13 vehicles, were built to this rather more flamboyant design, looking very much like American buses of the time. The actual S13 itself started off all red, but was a semi-coach, and so after a while was painted with a black roof so that they would then be used as relief vehicles on coach services. The coach fleet itself continued to be developed with the C3 and the C4 coaches, the C3 being for express services and the C4, top right there, with roof lights as well, being used for extended tours. The tours programme was extremely successful. They were very, very popular, and there were queues outside the headquarters of Midland Red in Bearwood on the day that bookings commenced each autumn for the following year. And you would have been dealt with by one of the ladies in the picture below if you went in to order one of these trips. There was further purchasing of bought-in double-deckers at this time. 100 of these Leyland Titans came with full fronts of Midland Red design. The top picture shows one of them at Stratford-on-Avon. Very fine vehicles. In the lower picture, you have the comparison of these Leyland buses with the own-built D7 double-decker, which shows the similarity of the design. But that design was adopted by Leyland for the Titan and offered to other companies, and was in use throughout the United Kingdom, became the standard in Edinburgh and Dublin, and even in Madrid. So it shows the influence of Midland Red design for other operators. The peak of the company came in the early 1950s. In 1956, there were 1,900 buses and coaches. There was a policy to provide double-deckers wherever possible. The service network was 12,000 square miles, 6,500 route miles, 79 million miles operated, and 500 million passengers carried a year. There were 1,150 separate stage carriage services serving 15 counties, together with a large and immaculate coach fleet on expresses and cruises. The coaches ran all over the UK on expresses and tours. Problems began to arise in the 1950s throughout the bus industry. In 1950, a government levy on fuel caused the first fares increase ever. TV began to destroy the evening leisure markets. Pressure for wage increases from the staff when staff costs were over 50% of total costs. Increasing traffic led to congestion, which delayed services and led to a further loss of passengers, the vicious circle commencing. There was a continuing search for economies. Midland Red took a lead with poster campaigns to try and encourage off-peak travel. They also continued the search for ever lighter vehicles with high capacity. After a prototype lightweight bus in 1951, Midland Red developed the S14. It was a fully integral single-decker built around a frame provided by metal sections of Oldbury to Midland Red design, and increasing amounts of fiberglass used in the production of the vehicle. It has single rear wheels and weighed just over 5 tonnes, with a 44-seat body. Midland Red planned a 12-year life for these vehicles and then disposed of them. That was a policy, and by 12 years, design had increased such that they would want a new style of vehicle in any case. There was no attempt to build a vehicle that would last longer than that. It was interesting at this stage that they discovered a bus from the mid-1930s with almost the same registration number as one of the S14s. So here we have AHA 554 of 1935 and 554 AHA of 1956 standing next to each other, but they were not both together for very long. The S14 developed to the S15 semi-coach, 40 luxurious seats, twin rear wheels on this occasion, and further developments. For instance, one of these had a fully fiberglass roof, which made it very light and airy inside. Midland Red also encouraged the development of the Orion body by Metro Camel, producing these D7 buses to Midland Red and Metro Camel design in 1953 to 57. A very lightweight design, which became very influential throughout the industry. Here's a picture now in Stafford Garage in 1961 with 3 of these D7s alongside single deckers of the period, showing the range of vehicles that most garages were operating at the time. The D9 was a good-looking bus and was the logical result of the lightweight and integral construction vehicles the company had been building, with ideas towards its design evident from around 1950. It was a fully integral double-decker built on metal sections frames with extensive use of fiberglass throughout. It had a 10.5 litre engine, semi-automatic transmission, power steering and weighed just over 8 tonnes. They originally had disc brakes, but these were replaced by drum brakes, which were less effective, unfortunate as it was quite a fast bus. 350 of these were built between 1960 and 1966. Here were the frames being assembled, not based on subframes as the RM. The C5 coach was developed from the S14 and S15 single-deckers with a new and very stylish body. In the lower picture, we have 4 generations of Midland Red coach, the ONC second from the right, the C1 on the left, C3 on the far right, and the C5 second from the left. There were 64 C5s in total, including motorway and service coaches. Midland Red's Motorway Express service started on the day the M1 opened in November 1959. Sinclair had clearly taken note of the American Greyhound operation on his visit 11 years earlier. The coaches were a development of the C5 with an 8-litre turbocharged engine, higher rear axle ratio, 5-speed gearbox, and developments with the manufacturers in fuel, oil, tyres and brakes. This was the first high-speed motorway operation in the country, with coaches running at around 80 miles an hour for extended periods. Remember that they had been legally limited to 30 miles an hour on all other roads until then. Other operators ran motorway services, but not motorway expresses like this. Do you remember the M1 motorway being like this in the early 1960s, almost empty compared to today? Midland Red's coaches had an impressive reputation. Motorists would see a red dot in their rear-view mirror, which gradually got larger until the Midland Red coach zipped past them. They had a comfortable interior with leopard spot moquette and a toilet at the rear. Here is one at Victoria Coach Station, having its tyres checked before the return journey. And here is Midland Red's poster for the service. Manufacturers also wanted to be associated with this success story and gave it full coverage in their advertisements. The ultimate accolade, of course, was when it appeared as one of the exploded diagrams in the Eagle comic. In the first year of the Motorway Express, there were 5,000 journeys, 150,000 passengers, 623,000 miles without so much as a scratched finger. No accidents, only 12 of 5,000 journeys were late, and they were due to London traffic, ice and fog. It's worth thinking about the drivers themselves, how the big bus companies recruited them. If you were a bus driver with some years of good, reliable service, you were punctual, looked the part, you were polite with passengers, then you could get on the coach driving list, probably for the summer months at first. After that, you could become full-time on the coaches, and these 18 were recruited from those men, the best 18 out of several thousand Midland Red drivers. More CM5 coaches without a toilet were used for the Nuneaton London service and for a new service from Birmingham to Worcester when the M5 motorway was built. And still there was more to come. Perhaps the greatest engineering achievement was the D10 of 1960. Sinclair continued to be suspicious of rear engines and wanted a maximum capacity double-decker with underfloor engine as on his successful single-deckers. He achieved this with full-height gangways on both decks, 78 seats, integral construction, the underfloor engine of 10.5 litres and many parts common to the D9 and S14. There were two prototypes, the second with two doors and staircases, though this soon reverted to single. Remember that it was around 20 years before a similar vehicle was built, the Volvo City Bus. Illuminated adverts were a fashion of the time, making attractive nighttime pictures. Many D9s had them and one S14, though as elsewhere they were not successful commercially. Coaches needed to be kept to a high standard for frontline service, and in 1962, 19 C2 and C3 coaches were rebodied by Plaxton. They were delivered in cream in the fashion of the time, but this was soon changed. Passengers wanted their red coach. They couldn't find a cream one amongst all the others in the coach park, and there was even a story of a hotelier refusing to receive passengers on the tour because he didn't believe it was a Midland Red coach. In November 1963, the new Birmingham bus station was opened as part of the Bullring development in the city centre. This brought together nearly all Midland Red's Birmingham services from several termini dotted around central Birmingham. But it was a dreadful place, dark and full of diesel fumes. Thankfully, my service to Kidderminster left from Bay 1, Stand 1, right by the exit, so there was plenty of fresh air. The CM5 motorway coaches were the victims of their own success. So many passengers travelled that they were quickly too small. Sinclair campaigned for larger coaches to be allowed. He wanted 45 feet long for motorway services. So he rebuilt an old single-decker to 45 feet long, painted green, and had it driven to London, where it successfully negotiated the streets of the Ministry of Transport and was inspected there by officials. He didn't get 45 feet, but this did lead to 36-foot single-deckers and coaches. A batch of Leyland Leopards bought, and 50 S16s were quickly constructed, clearly a development of the S14-15. This is an S16, bottom right, soon followed by the S17, which looked similar but had the larger 10.5 litre engine and semi-automatic transmission. And so here is how things looked then. This is Shrewsbury with an LS18 in the background, S13 and S15 dual-purpose vehicles in the foreground. A prototype 36-foot-long motorway coach was built very quickly in 1963, and here it is, alongside a train and other traffic, looking very much like the C5 coach elongated, and after trials with this vehicle, a fleet of 26 vehicles to a revised design were built, which then provided the service on the motorway. From then on, Midland Red was buying Leyland coaches, initially built by Dupel in this case, and subsequently by Plaxton. There were large numbers of D9 double-deckers being built at that stage. It's interesting to look at this construction method. I mentioned the extensive use of fiberglass, and by this time they were building single-piece roofs with front and rear domes. And here is the work going on in the Carlisle Road Works. The fiberglass mould on the left there, and then on the right being picked up and carried to the bus, and in the third picture installed on the roof of the bus in the lower picture. In order to increase the number of high-capacity double-deckers in the fleet, 50 Daimler Fleet lines were bought in 1963, with Alexander bodies to this design, very similar to bodies built for other operators, but with flat screens on both decks at the front. More of these buses were bought in the period up to 1969, making 269 of them in total. The single-decker fleet was also upgraded, initially with Leyland BET-style single-deckers like the one in the lower picture here, to act as semi-coaches, but then with 3 classes of Midland Red built single-deckers, the first of which was the S21, in the upper picture there, a semi-coach with 49 luxurious seats and available to be used as coaches or as buses. They were followed by 36 S22s, which were semi-coaches for longer distance services, and then with S23s, which were 51-seat service buses, and were the last Midland Red buses built. It was proving very difficult to keep and maintain engineering staff as well as operating staff at this time, at the end of the 1960s. There was tremendous competition from the motor industry for staff. The staff who had joined in the 1920s were by now retiring and were proving difficult to replace. So some vehicles were finished off by Plaxton's and some by Willowbrook. And here we have the last completely Midland Red built vehicle, an S23, on the 5th of January 1970, with the staff who had put it together. It is said that a new engineer joining the company from another company within the BET group pointed out that he could by now actually buy Leyland Leopards more cheaply than it was costing Midland Red. And so economies of scale, or diseconomies of very small scale, were acting against the company by this time, in addition to the problem of recruiting the staff to carry out the work. Operating staff were also in desperately short supply and continued to retire. Here's a rather nice picture from Albury in the 1960s of a long-serving driver on his last trip back into the garage being towed in by his workmates. From 1970 onwards, Midland Red did continue to be innovative in its own way, needing to rapidly replace some of the own-build smaller buses that were now life expired. A large number of Ford R192 buses were bought with Plaxton bodies, and these rapidly came into service to replace older expired vehicles. The other innovation was with the use of computers. Midland Red was quite forward in this. Quickly got a computer to do the staff payrolls and to begin to do other work. If you remember computers at that time, they were huge, great things in special rooms in buildings with air conditioning and so on. And here are a number of officials from the national bus companies coming to have a look at the system. But when you think about it, this entire system probably has less capacity in it, less power in it than the mobile phones that we're all carrying around today. And so Midland Red became part of the National Bus Company and began to receive Leyland Nationals, though they also made a point of buying a considerable number of Leyland Leopard dual-purpose vehicles as well. Interestingly, at this time, as the early D9s began to be withdrawn from service, some of them began to appear in London. And here are a couple that worked for the Ensign Bus Company on behalf of Lesney, carrying workers to the Matchbox toy factory in Hackney Wick. But more famously, some of them appeared on the Round London Sightseeing Tour, operated by Leon Daniels, of course, as Obsolete Fleet, and most of them converted to open top for the tour. They were seen as workable by one man because of the platform doors on the back, and they had 40 seats on top, so they were very productive for that service. They were very reliable buses, though the drivers did have something to say about the brakes. And here's another interesting use of them, because at the time that Margaret Thatcher was closing down the Greater London Council and Ken Livingstone was arguing that it should be retained, he hired one of these buses from Leon Daniels, driven by Dave Wetzel, his deputy and transport leader, who was a bus driver, and this was used on a tour around London campaigning to keep the GLC. And very many years later, Dave Wetzel came across Leon Daniels and told him off for supplying a bus with such bad brakes. So what became of Midland Red? I suppose you could say that it was hung, drawn and quartered. Hung in the sense that Walter Omar, the general manager, when it was under BEC, was rather hung out to dry by his superiors. When the proposals for nationalisation of all the bus companies came forward, he led a campaign against it. Here are some of the vehicles that he used with other operators in the West Midlands to campaign against this development. While he was doing that, his superiors at BEC headquarters were negotiating the sale of the company. They could see the way that the industry was going, they could see that it was in decline, and they were being offered a very good price by the government to buy it. And so they sold it. It is said that he was given half an hour's notice of their decision. But he nevertheless ran this campaign with vehicles from a number of West Midland operators parading the streets and holding protest meetings and so on. An interesting vehicle that joined in with this was owned at the time by Don Everall of Wolverhampton, who were a dealer and had one of the double-decker buses built for the Thames Tunnel in London in their stock. And so here it is taking part in those protests. The next thing that happened, of course, was the heart of Midland Red was drawn out from it. In 1969, the West Midlands Passenger Transport Executive took over the West Midlands operations of Birmingham, Walsall, West Bromwich and Wolverhampton corporations. In 1973, they bought the West Midlands services, garages and buses of Midland Red. And so all of these, in the heart of the company's operations, were taken away from it. In 1981, the company was quartered when the remnants of the company were divided into four: Midland Red North, South, East and West, and handed to adjacent companies to share in the management of them. Midland Red, still working together through the different companies to some degree, did fight back. They were upgrading the limited stop services. They were doing what they could to improve the quality of the operations. But of course it was a declining industry, as we know. But the memory of Midland Red lives on at the Whittle Transport Museum. Here are some of the vehicles there. There is one of those pre-war single-deckers in fine condition, and you can ride on it from time to time at the museum, together with a range of buses going back through the history of the company. In particular, the D10 prototype double-decker is there, and it is regularly in service, and you may well be able to have a ride on it, which is an experience well worth having. I also want to mention at this point the bus archive. And many of the pictures here have come from the bus archive, for which my thanks. It is a tremendous source of information on the history of our industry. When I first went to Droitwich to look at what they had there, I found documents confirming some of my earliest memories as a small boy in Kidderminster. I worked as a conductor in Kidderminster in 1968-9, and 40 years later I found this picture of many of the drivers I'd worked with, well, at least those who hadn't had an accident, receiving their safe driving awards at that time. There's the Colonel in the middle with his handlebar moustache, and the coach driver, two to the left of him, who drove a crash gearbox D7 so smoothly through the rush hour town centre that you barely notice the gear changes or the corners, which helps when you've got 70 fares to collect. And at the beginning I mentioned the garage boy at Deal, who followed Wyndhamshire to Birmingham. Well, here he is on his retirement in 1958 with his wife after his career at Midland Red Central Works. So now at the end of this talk I can mention two books on Midland Red. The first one, Midland Red Style. My wish to publicise Midland Red's posters and adverts and so on produced this book jointly with Malcolm Keeley to give a history of the company. Midland Red Style, published in 2011, full of posters and images of Midland Red's design. Our more recent book is Streets and Lanes of Midland Red, again published by Capital Transport, after Mick Webber's excellent book on Streets of London Transport. There are not as many official photos available for Midland Red as there are for London, and our book, published last year, shows Midland Red vehicles at work with lots of animated scenes covering the whole of the Midlands. Both books are available from the London Transport Museum shop, from all good booksellers, and direct from Capital Transport themselves. So thanks for joining me in this brief history of Midland Red. I particularly want to thank the Bus Archive for the use of a lot of their pictures here. I also thank Barry Lejeune, Bruce Jenkins, David Cole, Ken Jubb and Roland Box for pictures, as well as using some of my own and postcards that I've collected over the years. Thanks again for joining us, and I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. That's a very comprehensive history of a fascinating company. The connections and comparisons with London Transport are intriguing, covering as they do common personalities, contemporary vehicle designs, and a collective passion for well-designed publicity. I did know about the operation of Midland Red buses on London sightseeing tours, but not their use in promoting Ken Livingstone, and I certainly wasn't expecting to see a photo of the Dartford Tunnel cycle buses. You've shown us a really marvellous collection of photographs. Before we sign off, can I say to anyone watching this who's not already a member of the Friends, please do think about joining us. It's a great way of supporting the museum and of connecting with London's transport heritage. Go to the Friends website for further details. So, thanks again to Roger for an excellent talk. Thanks to everyone for watching. Join us again soon for another of our at-home presentations.